Ethan Cole had spent the better part of his adult life designing buildings that were supposed to outlast him, structures in Chicago that stood tall and cold, made of glass and steel, until the day he walked away from all of it. Once, he had been celebrated as the kind of architect who could take an investor's vague dream and turn it into a skyline landmark. But after the collapse of his marriage and a scandal that wasn't entirely his fault, though his name had been dragged through the mud, he realized that cities only amplified what was already broken inside him. So he packed what little mattered, left the crowded towers behind, and drove north until the traffic thinned and the air grew sharper, until he found himself staring at a weathered cabin in Vermont that looked like it had been holding its breath for decades, waiting for someone stubborn enough to bring it back to life. The cabin wasn't large or impressive. Its roof sagged slightly under the weight of too many winters, and the porch leaned like an old man trying to stay upright. But when Ethan stepped across the threshold for the first time and smelled the mix of pine, dust, and wood smoke, he knew it was a place where he could start over without anyone demanding blueprints or speeches about vision. Here, tucked between the endless trees, he could hear himself think for the first time in years. And though he had no illusions about the amount of work required, the plumbing was archaic, the wiring outdated, and the chimney clogged, there was a certain comfort in problems that could be solved with his own hands and a hammer rather than with lawyers and board meetings. The locals hardly noticed him, which was exactly what he wanted. The nearest settlement was a cluster of homes tied together by a homeowners association, a neat little development that prided itself on uniform mailboxes and manicured lawns, but Ethan's cabin stood on an entirely separate parcel, an older deed that predated their bylaws. He never signed their forms, never paid their dues, and assumed reasonably that he would never have to. His land was his, bounded by surveyor's markers and confirmed by county records, and the quiet suited him. On mornings he would rise before dawn, make coffee on the rusted old stove, and sketch by the window as fog drifted low across the ground, filling the hollows like a sea that only he could witness. At night he would sit on the porch with a lantern, listening to the whip-poor-wills, wondering how many years of noise and deadlines it would take before other men realized how precious silence could be. It was during one of those nights as he was oiling the hinges of the warped front door that he noticed the envelope tucked under the heavy iron handle. At first, he assumed it was from a delivery service that had gotten lost, maybe something redirected from his old life, but the letterhead froze him. A crisp, embossed emblem reading Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. He frowned, sitting down on the porch steps to read it, the lantern light spilling across the page. The letter was firm, written in the sterile language of authority, informing him that his cabin had been classified as collateral for outstanding debts incurred by the association, that his parcel was part of the expanded jurisdiction of Maple Ridge, and that failure to cooperate would result in foreclosure procedures under the bylaws. Ethan read it twice, then a third time, his heartbeat slowing into something heavier than shock. They had made a mistake. It had to be a mistake. His property wasn't part of their development, and no signature of his had ever tied him to their rules. Yet, there it was, printed in black ink, a claim that his refuge had already been leveraged to cover loans he had never heard of. He stared into the trees for a long time, the chirring of crickets filling the silence. In another life he might have panicked, called an attorney, wasted money fighting endless paperwork, but Ethan had learned something in the years since leaving Chicago. Panic gave people like those in charge of associations exactly what they wanted. Instead, he set the letter aside, leaned back against the porch railing, and let a smile ghost across his face, because beneath the indignation and disbelief there was a truth only he knew. When the letter warned that the bank now recognized his cabin as collateral, they had chosen the wrong target. The debt they believed gave them power over him rested with a financial institution whose controlling interest belonged to none other than Ethan Cole himself, purchased quietly years ago as part of an investment portfolio he had never spoken about. They thought they had trapped him, but in reality they had just stumbled into his domain. The forest around him seemed to press closer, as if holding its breath with him, and for the first time since arriving in Vermont, Ethan realized that peace was never permanent. But sometimes conflict arrived as an opportunity, and this time he was ready. The following morning, Ethan drove into the nearest town with the envelope folded carefully in his jacket pocket, his thoughts moving slower than the car tires on the frost-crusted road, replaying the words of the letter as if by reading them over and over he could force them into making sense. The office of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association occupied a converted two-story colonial on the edge of the development, its white clapboard siding gleaming too perfectly under the winter sun, a building that seemed designed to project order and authority. He parked on the street rather than the manicured lot, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of treating their space like it had any jurisdiction over him, and stepped inside, where the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and bureaucracy. A receptionist with a brittle smile looked up from her computer and asked if he had an appointment, and when he explained that he had received a letter claiming his cabin as collateral, her smile thinned to the practiced neutrality of someone trained to deflect. She disappeared into the back without another word, leaving him to stand in the sterile, quiet lobby with its framed photographs of neighborhood block parties, playgrounds, and newly painted fences, all carefully curated images of conformity he had no desire to join. After several long minutes, a woman in her 50s emerged, her tailored suit the color of cold ash, her hair pulled back in a severe knot, her eyes sharp behind rimless glasses that caught the light. "Mr. Cole," she said with a practiced tone of cordiality, "I'm Madison Greer, president of Maple Ridge Association. Please, come with me." She led him into a conference room lined with shelves of binders, each labeled with neat white tags. Covenants, amendments, enforcement. She gestured toward a chair across from her and waited until he sat, then placed a file on the table and folded her hands on top of it. "You've come about the collateral notification. I understand it must be unsettling, but let me clarify the matter." Her voice carried the smooth confidence of someone who had delivered this speech before, and Ethan listened, expression blank, as she explained that Maple Ridge had recently refinanced a set of loans for community improvements, including road resurfacing, lighting upgrades, and a proposed recreation center. To secure favorable terms, the association had included parcels listed in the county's jurisdictional maps, and, according to those maps, his cabin fell within the expanded boundary adopted by amendment 3 years prior. The previous owner, she claimed, had never contested the inclusion, and therefore, by their records, his property was considered part of the association's assets. Ethan let her speak without interruption, his mind catching on the words, "by their records," because he knew enough about contracts and deeds to recognize the vagueness of her position. When she finished, she smiled with an air of finality, as though the matter had been neatly resolved by the mere act of explanation. "So, you see, Mr. Cole, there is no cause for alarm. As long as assessments are kept current, the association retains healthy standing with our lender, and naturally, your property, while technically collateral, remains in your possession. If you wish to dispute the classification, you're welcome to seek legal counsel, though I must warn you, it can be a lengthy and costly process." Ethan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her shift, slightly, just enough for him to notice. "You're saying my cabin, a structure built 50 years before your development existed, is suddenly subject to your bylaws because you decided to redraw a line on a map." Madison's smile faltered for the briefest instant, then returned, thinner. "We didn't decide, Mr. Cole. The amendment was voted upon by the association membership and filed with the county. It is perfectly valid." Ethan let the silence stretch until the ticking of the wall clock became the only sound. "You'll forgive me," he said finally, his voice low and even. if I don't consider your membership's vote binding on land that doesn't belong to them?" For a flicker of a second, he saw something behind her calm mask. Irritation, maybe contempt, but it was quickly buried beneath the polished exterior. She closed the file and slid it back toward her. "If that is your position, then I strongly suggest you retain legal counsel. As far as this office is concerned, the matter is settled." Ethan stood, tucking the envelope back into his pocket. "I'll do that," he said, though his tone carried a weight she didn't seem to recognize. Outside, the winter air hit his face like a bracing slap, and as he walked back to his car, he considered the implications. They had not simply made a clerical error. They had deliberately included his land to inflate their collateral, banking on the assumption that no one would challenge them. It was a gamble, and one they had gotten away with before, judging by Madison's rehearsed delivery. Most people, faced with legal costs and the endless grind of bureaucracy, would cave. Ethan wasn't most people. He drove back to the cabin, the road twisting through bare trees, his thoughts layering into something sharper than anger, something closer to amusement. That night, under the dim glow of the lantern, he unfolded the letter again, this time reading it not as a threat but as an unintentional confession. They had invoked the bank as the authority behind their claim, a faceless institution meant to intimidate. But what Madison and her board could not possibly know was that Ethan Cole, after years of investing in distressed financial portfolios, during the crash had quietly acquired controlling interest in that very institution. He rarely thought about it anymore. The bank was managed by executives who never connected his Vermont address to the silent shareholder in their reports. But now, for the first time, he considered how useful that position could be. They believed they held power because they had attached his property to their debt. In reality, the debt itself belonged to him, and with it, their fragile authority. Ethan set the paper down, the lantern flame wavering as a draft passed through the cracked window frame, and felt the old architect's instinct stirring inside him, the one that always asked where the weak point in a structure lay. Madison Greer had built her power on a foundation of borrowed money and forged boundaries, but every foundation had a fault line, and he knew exactly where hers ran. All he had to do was apply pressure, and the entire edifice of Maple Ridge would begin to crack. 2 days after his meeting with Madison Greer, Ethan woke to the sound of gravel crunching outside his cabin, an unusual noise in the stillness of early morning, and when he stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee in hand, he saw a white pickup truck parked crookedly at the edge of his property line. 2 men in reflective vests were unloading equipment, tripods, measuring rods, and surveyor's scopes, working with the casual efficiency of people who believed they had every right to be there. One of them glanced up, met Ethan's gaze briefly, then returned to setting up his instruments without acknowledgement, as though the owner of the land were nothing more than a passing inconvenience. Ethan set down his mug, pulled on his jacket, and walked toward them with measured steps, each crunch of his boots on the frostbitten earth echoing the tension in his chest. When he reached them, he asked evenly what they thought they were doing, and the older of the 2 replied with rehearsed indifference that they were conducting boundary assessments for Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, pursuant to the Collateral agreement on record. Ethan studied the man's face, noting the way his eyes avoided direct contact, the way his tone implied he expected no resistance, and then told them flatly that this was private land, not subject to their authority, and they needed to pack up. Immediately, the younger man shifted uneasily, but the older one smirked, tapped the laminated badge clipped to his vest, and said, "We've got authorization from the board. You can take it up with them." Ethan said nothing more, simply pulled his phone from his pocket and took a slow, deliberate photograph of the truck's license plate, then the equipment, then the men themselves. The older man's smirk faded into irritation, but he didn't object. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll finish later." They packed their gear with less care than they had unpacked it and drove off, leaving fresh tire tracks gouged into the soil. Ethan stood there until the sound of the truck faded, then turned back to his cabin, the weight of the moment pressing into him. This wasn't random testing. It was an assertion of control, a message delivered in the language of trespass. Later that day, when he went into town for supplies, Ethan stopped by the county clerk's office, a cramped space where stacks of file boxes leaned precariously against the walls, and requested access to the most recent plat maps for his parcel. The clerk, a weary man with nicotine-stained fingers, pulled the file reluctantly, flipping through the records until he found the relevant documents. Ethan leaned over the counter, scanning the maps, and felt the chill of recognition. The official lines had been redrawn. His cabin's parcel, once clearly outside the shaded boundaries of Maple Ridge, was now included, with a notation citing Jurisdictional Amendment 2019. The amendment bore signatures of the HOA board members and, most disturbingly, what purported to be his own signature of consent. Ethan stared at the looping scrawl that was supposed to be his name and felt a mixture of fury and something colder, a clinical detachment born from years of examining architectural drafts where the smallest forgery or misalignment could undermine the entire design. The signature was crude, the angle of the pen strokes inconsistent with his hand, the spacing wrong, but to an official record it looked sufficient. He requested a certified copy and left the office, gripping the envelope tightly, his mind already racing through the implications. The association hadn't just overreached, they had fabricated his consent. It was no longer a dispute about jurisdiction, but a deliberate act of fraud, one they clearly assumed he would lack the resources or stamina to challenge. Back at the cabin, Ethan spread the documents on the table, the plat map beside the letter from Maple Ridge, and studied them under the flickering light of the oil lamp. His years as an architect had trained him to see structures not just for what they were, but for the weaknesses built into them, and what he saw now was a structure of deception, layered but fragile. The forgery was the weak point. Pull on it hard enough and the rest would unravel. That night, as he sat with his notes spread around him, headlights flared briefly through the trees, a vehicle slowing near his driveway before rolling on. He rose and stepped to the window, but by then the road was empty again, leaving only the hush of the forest. A warning, perhaps, or surveillance. Either way, it confirmed what he already knew. The board was escalating. The following morning, Ethan received another letter, this one taped to his cabin door with blue painter's tape, as though the delivery itself were an act of occupation. It was a notice of temporary asset control, declaring that due to unpaid assessments and association liens, Maple Ridge would be installing a lockbox on his property to secure their collateral. The letter was unsigned, only stamped with the association's emblem. He laughed quietly as he read it, not with humor but with the clarity of a man who had already decided the course of action. They were bluffing with the confidence of predators who had never met prey capable of biting back. He folded the letter carefully, placed it with the forged plat map, and wrote a single note in the margin: leverage. He spent the afternoon drafting a message, not to the association, but to the executive office of the bank that held Maple Ridge's loans, an office whose directors received quarterly reports with his name discreetly attached as the majority shareholder. His message was simple, devoid of theatrics, a request for a full audit of Maple Ridge's collateral filings, citing irregularities in county documentation. He knew the request would ripple through the hierarchy like a fault line, unsettling board members who thought themselves untouchable because a bank's patience with fraudulent collateral was thin, and exposure meant not just embarrassment, but potential criminal liability. When he sealed the envelope, he felt the weight of the coming conflict settle into his bones, not as dread, but as certainty. The first move had been theirs, but the counterstroke was his, and unlike them, he wasn't relying on forged maps or fabricated signatures. He was relying on something far stronger, ownership of the very institution they had invoked as their shield. And now that shield belonged to him. A week passed before Ethan received the call he had been waiting for, though when the bank's general counsel reached him on the cabin's landline, a relic he had installed partly out of nostalgia and partly because cell service was unreliable this far. Into the hills. The voice on the other end carried a weight that told him the ripple he had started had turned into a wave. The counsel, a precise man named Adrian Keller whose clipped diction reminded Ethan of a draftsman measuring tolerances, confirmed that the audit request had revealed irregularities in Maple Ridge's collateral filings. Certain parcels had been included without properly recorded deeds of consent, signatures appeared inconsistent, and internal notes suggested that the board had relied on assumed jurisdiction rather than verifiable ownership. Ethan listened silently, pen scratching across his notepad, until Keller paused and asked whether he wanted the matter escalated to external counsel. Ethan considered the question, then told him not yet that he wanted to review the findings in person before decisions were made. Keller agreed, though Ethan could tell by the hesitation in his voice that the man had already grasped the unusual dynamic here, that the shareholder requesting this level of scrutiny was not merely protecting capital, but something more personal. 2 days later, Ethan drove into the city, a place he had largely avoided since retreating to Vermont, and entered the bank's headquarters, a tower of dark glass that reflected the winter sky in fractured panes. The lobby was cavernous, marble floors echoing the shuffle of footsteps, and as he moved through security and into the executive conference room, he felt the familiar current of power that always flowed in places where money was transmuted into influence. Keller was waiting with 2 associates. Thick binders spread across the table, and he gestured for Ethan to sit. They began with the filings, laying out the maps, signatures, and collateral agreements, each one marked with sticky notes highlighting inconsistencies. Ethan leaned forward, studying the documents with the same focus he once gave to blueprints, noting where lines failed to align, where ink blotches betrayed a shaky hand, where dates on notarizations coincided suspiciously with weekends when county. Offices were closed. His architect's mind, trained to detect structural flaws, recognized the pattern immediately. The forgery was systemic, not incidental, and had been carried out with the confidence of people who believed no one would bother looking closely. When Keller finished, he closed the binder with a decisive snap and said the bank could, at Ethan's direction, declare Maple Ridge in breach of its loan covenants, which would trigger foreclosure on the association itself. Ethan absorbed the words, his gaze drifting to the skyline beyond the glass windows, the buildings he had once designed standing among strangers, monuments to a life that seemed both close and impossibly distant. To destroy Maple Ridge now would be simple, even satisfying, but part of him wanted to see the structure collapse under its own weight rather than through a single decisive strike. "Not yet," he said finally, turning back to Keller. "Keep the findings internal. No notices, no official moves. I want to see how they behave when they don't know the walls are already crumbling." Keller nodded, though his expression betrayed discomfort, as though he sensed that Ethan was playing a game larger than the bank itself. Back in Vermont, Ethan carried the knowledge like a hidden weapon, watching the days unfold with a patience that unnerved him. The association did not know yet that their maneuver had been exposed, so they continued with the arrogance of people convinced of their own impunity. Within a week, 2 men arrived unannounced at his cabin again, this time in suits rather than reflective vests, introducing themselves as asset managers contracted by Maple Ridge. They attempted to step onto his porch with clipboards in hand, reciting a memorized line about inventorying collateral improvements, and Ethan blocked the doorway with his frame, his silence more effective than argument. When they asked whether he understood the consequences of obstruction, he merely smiled. Not the polite smile of concession, but the kind that made their words falter, and eventually they retreated, muttering about non-compliance as they climbed into their car. He watched them drive away, the taillights disappearing into the woods, and noted how quickly the tone had shifted. The board was escalating from paperwork to intimidation. That night he took out the audit findings again, laying them across the table, and thought about Madison Greer, about the thinly veiled contempt in her voice when she told him to get a lawyer, about the quiet confidence that came from years of bullying weaker opponents into submission. He realized she was not simply greedy but desperate. Associations did not leverage collateral unless they were drowning, and if Maple Ridge had taken the risk of fabricating his signature, it meant their survival depended on keeping up the illusion of solvency. That gave him leverage beyond property or paperwork. It gave him control over their fear. The true midpoint came not in a boardroom or a courtroom, but in the old town hall, where Ethan walked one evening unannounced into a monthly Maple Ridge membership meeting. The room smelled faintly of dust and old varnish. Folding chairs arranged in rows facing a dais where Madison presided with her fellow board members, their polished demeanor cracking slightly as they saw him stride through the door. He took a seat at the back, saying nothing, letting the whispers ripple through the room as homeowners glanced nervously at him, recognizing him as the outsider whose cabin was supposedly dragging down their finances. Madison cleared her throat, tried to continue with the agenda, but her voice faltered when Ethan raised his hand and asked calmly whether the membership had ever voted to include his property in their collateral package. The silence that followed was more damning than any answer. Some looked confused, others uneasy, and a few openly suspicious, realizing perhaps for the first time that the board had overstepped. Madison recovered quickly, insisting the matter was settled years ago, that records confirmed consent, but Ethan stood, drew from his jacket the certified copy of the forged plat map, and held it up so the homeowners could see. "That is not my signature," he said evenly, his voice carrying through the hall with the weight of certainty. For a long moment no one spoke. Then an older man in the front row, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses, asked Madison when the amendment had been filed, because he remembered the cabin standing apart, never paying dues, never bound by their covenants. Madison's smile returned, brittle and strained, as she insisted the matter was administrative, nothing more. But Ethan saw the doubt spreading, the foundation cracking beneath her. He tucked the document back into his jacket, gave her a nod that was equal parts acknowledgement and challenge, and walked out without another word. The meeting dissolved into murmurs, the sound of suspicion blooming. Back at his cabin, he lit the lantern and sat by the window, listening to the forest press close around him. The midpoint had arrived, though not in the way stories usually framed it. This was not victory or defeat, but revelation. He held the power now, not through bluster or confrontation, but through the simple fact of truth backed by ownership. Madison could not know yet that the very bank she invoked as her authority was already under his control, but soon enough she would feel the pressure when the institution she leaned on turned its weight against her. For now, Ethan let the silence settle, the old cabin creaking softly as the wind moved through the trees, and he realized that the battle was no longer about survival. It was about dismantling a structure built on arrogance, brick by fraudulent brick until nothing remained but the rubble of its own deceit. The days after the town hall meeting unfolded with a tension that was almost physical, as though the air itself had thickened around Ethan's cabin, pressing against the windows and doors, reminding him that the confrontation with Maple Ridge had moved beyond paperwork and quiet threats. The board, stung by the seed of doubt he had planted among their membership, began to act with a frantic kind of aggression, their composure cracking. It started with small intrusions. 2 notices left on his property in the span of 3 days, one threatening fines for non-compliant exterior conditions, the other declaring an inspection, scheduled without his consent. Each notice bore the association's crest, but no personal signature, as though the board members had retreated behind the anonymity of their collective authority, unwilling to attach their names to the escalating harassment. Ethan collected the papers without response, tucking them into the growing file on his kitchen table, each one another layer of evidence that the association was not only reckless, but unraveling. One morning, as he returned from the general store in town, he noticed fresh tire tracks on the narrow path leading up to his cabin, deeper than his own, and when he rounded the bend, he found his porch light shattered, the bulb reduced to glittering, fragments on the wooden planks. The damage was minor, almost trivial, but it carried a message written in silence. We can reach you whenever we wish. He crouched, running his fingers over the shards, then rose without expression, carrying the weight of the moment into the cabin where he sat down at the table, unfolded the audit documents once more, and reminded himself that intimidation was always the tactic of people who had lost control of the real game. That afternoon the real escalation came. A man named Robert Hanley, one of the younger board members, appeared at his door with a forced air of civility, carrying a briefcase and the faint smell of cologne that tried and failed to disguise his nervousness. He introduced himself with a smile too wide, then launched into a rehearsed monologue about amicable resolution, offering Ethan what he described as a compromise. If Ethan would formally join the association, pay retroactive dues, and sign a release affirming Maple Ridge's jurisdiction, the board would rectify the collateral filing and ensure his property was no longer at risk of seizure. Ethan listened without interruption, his face unreadable, until Hanley finished and looked at him with hopeful expectancy, like a salesman convinced that a slick pitch could erase the stench of fraud. Then Ethan leaned forward, his voice quiet but sharp, asking Hanley whether he had ever considered the criminal liability of affixing his name to forged documents. The younger man's confidence faltered instantly, his face draining of color, and though he stammered a denial, Ethan's calm gaze pinned him like a specimen under glass. Hanley left quickly, his briefcase clutched like a shield, and Ethan knew with certainty that cracks were spreading inside the board itself. The following evening confirmed it. A call came to the cabin's landline, the voice on the other end hushed and uneven. It was George Latham, the elderly widower who had been a silent presence on the board for years. He admitted, with a weariness that suggested more shame than courage, that he could no longer stomach what Madison and the others were doing. He told Ethan of a safe kept in the basement of Madison's own house, where drafts of documents and unsigned templates were stored, including pages of copied signatures prepared for future contingencies. George spoke of meetings where dissent was crushed with veiled threats, of homeowners bullied into silence, of a desperate scheme to keep Maple Ridge solvent by continually inflating assets it did not own. His voice cracked when he said, "I thought it was just a formality at first, but now I see it's criminal." They won't stop, Ethan. They can't stop. Because if this collapses, they lose everything. Before hanging up, George begged him to be careful because Thomas Reed, another board member, had tried to distance himself once before and ended up dead in what the police had called a traffic accident, but which George now believed was no accident at all. That night, Ethan barely slept, his mind turning over the implications. The association had crossed from fraud into something darker, a willingness to silence even its own when the structure of lies threatened to fall. He rose before dawn, made coffee, and sat at the table staring at the faint outline of his reflection in the cabin's window. He had never intended for this fight to become a crusade, but as the wind rattled the panes and the trees outside groaned under the weight of winter, he understood that his role was no longer simply to defend his home. He was staring at a rot that had spread through the foundation of an entire community, and now that he had seen it, he could not walk away. 2 days later, another letter arrived, this one more brazen than the rest. It declared that the association had voted to authorize a lien on his property for non-payment of dues and assessments, effective immediately, and that failure to remit the stated amount would accelerate foreclosure proceedings. Ethan read the notice twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the growing stack of evidence. He did not respond directly to Maple Ridge. Instead, he sent a sealed packet of documents to Keller at the bank, enclosing the forged plat map, the unsigned notices, and a written statement of George Latham's revelations. His instructions were clear. Prepare to move. Not yet. Not until he gave the word. But be ready. The escalation had shifted the balance irrevocably. Maple Ridge had exposed its desperation, its willingness to forge, to threaten, even to endanger lives to protect its illusion of authority. And Ethan, holding the silent power of the bank in his hand, understood that the next strike would not merely weaken them. It would bring the entire edifice crashing down. The storm finally broke on a gray morning when the frost clung stubbornly to the trees, and the sky carried that heavy silence that comes before something decisive. Ethan had known the confrontation was inevitable, but even he had not expected Madison Greer to arrive at his cabin in person, stepping out of a dark sedan flanked by two men in heavy coats who carried themselves not like board members, but like enforcers accustomed to reminding people of consequences. She approached with the confidence of someone who had orchestrated 100 negotiations and believed she could still bend him, her heels crunching on the gravel, her expression fixed in the polite mask of authority that cracked only at the edges. Ethan opened the door before she could knock, leaning against the frame, letting the cold air swirl between them as she offered a smile that never reached her eyes. She began to speak of misunderstandings, of opportunities for compromise, of how unfortunate it would be for things to escalate further, but her tone shifted quickly, her words sharpening as she reminded him of what had happened to Thomas Reed. Her implication thinly veiled but deliberate. Ethan let her finish, then stepped aside and gestured for her to enter, surprising her with the invitation. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the threshold, her men following, their eyes darting across the interior of the cabin as though expecting evidence of weakness. Instead, they found the table laid out with folders, binders, and certified documents, each neatly arranged like exhibits waiting for a trial. Ethan closed the door and walked past them, his voice calm but carrying the weight of finality as he explained that Maple Ridge had already lost. He told her that the bank whose authority she had invoked so often no longer stood behind her, but behind him, that the audit she had never imagined would occur had already been completed, and that every forged signature, every fraudulent filing, every coerced amendment was now catalogued, notarized, and ready to be placed into the hands of both regulators and prosecutors. He watched her face carefully as the truth sank in, the brittle confidence splintering, the realization dawning that the ground she had stood on so arrogantly was nothing more than sand giving way beneath her feet. She tried to bluster, insisting that no court would side with him, that homeowners would rally to her defense, but Ethan shook his head slowly and slid a single sheet across the table toward her. It was a notice of default drafted by the bank's counsel, signed and sealed, declaring Maple Ridge in breach of its loan covenants and authorizing immediate foreclosure on the association itself. Madison stared at it as though it were a death sentence, her lips parting but no words coming, her hands trembling slightly before she pulled them back and pressed them tightly into her lap. One of her men stepped forward, muttering that they didn't have to listen to this, but Ethan's gaze stopped him cold, not with threat, but with certainty, the kind that came from knowing the battle had already been decided. The silence stretched until finally Madison spoke, her voice lower now, stripped of its polish, almost pleading. She asked what he wanted, whether there was a way to make this disappear, to settle quietly, to protect what remained of her reputation. Ethan studied her, the woman who had trespassed onto his land, who had fabricated his consent, who had threatened lives to maintain her illusion of power, and he told her with a clarity that brooked no argument that what he wanted was simple. Dissolution. Maple Ridge would be dismantled, its authority revoked, its debts called in, and its leadership held accountable for fraud. He would not accept compromise, not when the structure itself was rotten. When she realized he meant every word, she rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and for a moment he thought she might lash out, but instead she turned sharply, her heels striking the floor like hammers as she stormed toward the door. Her men followed, muttering under their breath, and within minutes the sedan was gone, its tires spitting gravel as it disappeared down the road. Ethan stood in the doorway watching the trees sway in the cold wind, the echoes of her departure fading, knowing that the climax had not been a shouting match or a violent confrontation, but the simple, irrefutable moment when power shifted. Irrevocably. That afternoon, Keller called again, his tone brisk but tinged with something like respect, confirming that the foreclosure notice had been executed, that Maple Ridge's accounts were frozen, its operations suspended, and that the state attorney's office had already been notified. Ethan listened, nodding though the man could not see him, and when the call ended he sat alone at the table, the cabin quiet except for the creak of the old beams, the weight of victory settling not as triumph but as inevitability. Madison Greer's empire had collapsed, not with fire or violence, but with the steady pressure of truth pressing against lies until the structure caved in on itself. And for the first time since the battle had begun, Ethan allowed himself to exhale, the long breath of a man who had carried the storm through to its end. In the weeks that followed the collapse of Maple Ridge, the development that had once carried itself with the rigid posture of order and authority seemed to sag like an abandoned stage set, its immaculate lawns no longer clipped with military precision, its newsletters silenced, its board meetings canceled with no explanation. Word spread quickly among the homeowners that the association's accounts were frozen, its contracts void, and its president under investigation for fraud. And though confusion and fear rippled through the streets at first, those emotions soon gave way to something more unexpected: relief. Neighbors who had lived under the constant scrutiny of Madison's rules began to talk freely for the first time in years, their conversations no longer shadowed by threats of fines or violations, and slowly they began to imagine a community not defined by rigid bylaws but by the simple fact of living side by side. Ethan watched it unfold from a distance, content to remain on the edge of their world. But one evening a group of residents knocked at his cabin door, their faces uncertain but sincere, as they told him that whatever grudges or suspicions had once lingered, they owed him a debt for exposing what they had been too frightened to confront. He listened quietly, then told them that he had no intention of controlling them, that their future was theirs to shape, and if they wished to form something new, a cooperative, an informal council, or nothing at all, it would be their choice, not imposed by fear. When they left, thanking him in subdued voices, Ethan stepped onto the porch and looked out over the dark line of trees, the air sharp with the scent of pine and thawing earth, and felt the cabin settle around him like a living thing. He had not come here to lead or to reform. He had come to vanish, to find silence after years of noise. And yet in defending that silence he had dismantled a structure that had strangled not only him but everyone bound to it. He knew Madison Greer would spend years untangling herself from the courts, that her name would be remembered not as a leader but as a warning, and he knew that Maple Ridge would never rise again in the form it once held. For him, the reward was not vengeance or recognition, but the return of stillness, the knowledge that the forest would wake each morning unchanged, that the cabin would hold against the seasons, and that when he walked its rooms he would hear only the sound of his own steps. For the first time in years, Ethan allowed himself the fragile luxury of believing that peace, however temporary, had been earned rather than borrowed, and as the night deepened, he sat on the porch with the lantern glowing faintly at his side, and let the quiet settle back into him like an old companion.